Gold was discovered in the Cassiar district of northern British Columbia, Canada, in 1872. That made Wrangell, Alaska, a boomtown. It had merchants, saloons, and dance halls. Wrangell was the closest port community with access to the gold fields by way of the Stikine River. More than $2 million in gold was taken out of the Cassiar, but by 1878, most of the men were moving on. Then prospectors began searching the mainland and islands of the southeast portion of the new territory of Alaska. In spite of the meager provisions they carried and the hardships they endured, a few of these early adventurers were quite successful in finding what they were looking for: gold. Hello and welcome to Juneau, Alaska. When many people hear the words gold and Alaska together, they think of the famous Klondike Gold Rush, and they vision the prospectors struggling up over the Chilkoot Pass on their way to the gold fields in hopes of earning their fortunes. Well, that occurred in 1898. It was in 1880 when two prospectors by the name of Joe Juneau and Richard Harris staked the first gold claims here in the Juneau area. They did that on the back side of the mountain behind me at a place called Silver Bow Basin. We are on Douglas Island, which lies within the present-day city and borough of Juneau. This place is known locally as Sandy Beach. It's a popular place to walk your dog, have a picnic, build sandcastles on the 4th of July, fly your kite. It's even a place where kids swim on those warm days we have here. The sand here at Sandy Beach is not a product of natural erosion. This is tailings from a gold mine. It was a mining operation that blasted the rock out of the mountain and pulverized it to this consistency so that they could separate the gold from the ore. This was the Treadwell mine. The Treadwell mine was not Alaska's first gold mine, but it was its first major gold mine, and certainly the most successful in its day. During most of its operating years of 1885 to 1917, this was the world's largest low-grade gold mine. It was the Treadwell mine that put Juneau on the map. My name is Rick Urian, and I'm going to be your guide here. We're going to take a look at Treadwell, the way it looks today, and we'll flash back to see what this looked like when the mine was in operation. You're going to get to see some of the faces of the people who lived and worked here. And you'll learn how they separated the gold from the ore. The success of that process is almost mind-boggling, because you see, it took an average of 8.5 tons of ore to produce 1 ounce of gold. So come with me and take a step back in time. After gold was discovered nearby, other prospectors began showing up in this area, seeking their fortunes. Where I'm standing was once the mouth of a stream that became known as Parish Creek. It wasn't too far up this stream where, on the 1st of May of 1881, a prospector named Pierre Ussard staked his claim. Ussard was also known as French Pete. Well, it was French Pete's claim that would change this area forever. We are now about 400 yards upstream. Today it's kind of hard to imagine that a stream once flowed down this valley, but it was near this very spot where Ussard found gold in his pan and staked his claim. Two other prospectors by the name of Ed Bean and Saul Matthews staked claims on the adjoining property to the southeast. In August of 1881, a man by the name of John Treadwell came to this area. He was representing a couple of investors from San Francisco named James Freeborn and John Fry. They wanted to invest in mining claims in Alaska. So in September of that year, Treadwell bought Usard's claim for $400. He also bought the claims that had been staked by Bean and Matthews. So it was these three claims that became the start of the Treadwell mine. Three prospectors by name of Pickett, Mitchell, and Lewis had staked the ground to the southeast of the Treadwell claims. Their claims would become the Mexican mine. And to the southeast of them, there were four prospectors that staked claims. Their names were Billy Meehan, James Rosewall, John Pryor, and T.C. Duran. Their claims would become the Ready Bullion mine. There was a strip of land between the Treadwell claims and the Mexican claims that was 700 feet wide. That would become the 700-foot mine. So it was these four mines on about 2 miles of beachfront that made up the Treadwell mine complex. The four mines had three owners. There was the Alaska Treadwell Gold Mining Company with the Treadwell mine, the Alaska Mexican Gold Mining Company with the Mexican mine, and then Alaska United Mining Company owned the Ready Bullion mine and the 700-foot mine. And although these three companies were financially independent of each other, it was the Treadwell Company that managed the entire complex. So after John Treadwell had purchased his claims, he gathered up 22 bags of ore from this area, which he took to California for testing. Above us here, other prospectors had staked claims on Paris Creek. They were placer miners, mining on the surface with gold pans and sluice boxes. They operated for a 3-year period above us here, and during that 3-year period they took $45,000 worth of gold. They took that from an area of Paris Creek that no longer exists. The results of the test of the ore that Treadwell had gathered up brought him back here in the spring of 1882. He brought with him this 5-stamp mill. And by August of that year, he had the setup on his property ready to start crushing ore. Treadwell's mill has been reconditioned, as on display here at Sandy Beach. Behind me here are the first 2 tunnels that were dug by Treadwell into his claim in 1882. One behind me and one off to my left. The mill was located close to the mine entrance here, just behind where the camera is located. Shortly after he got started here, John Treadwell had some conflicts with his nearest neighbors, the placer miners. They were using all the water, so there wasn't enough water for him to operate his mill. The Navy was brought in to establish a peaceful solution to the problem, and they decided that the placer miners would get the use of the water for the 12 hours during the daytime, and Treadwell got the use of the water for 12 hours at night. So both operations were able to proceed smoothly. The results that Treadwell got the very first summer of operation here with his little 5-stamp mill were so encouraging that the very next summer in 1883, they started to construct a large 120 stamp mill down below us here. This snow shed begins at Treadwell's first tunnel and leads to the mill. The mill, which became known as the 240 mill, was first called the Quartz Mill. When the second tunnel was dug, the snow shed was widened. One tunnel was for the full ore cars coming out of the mine. The other was for the empty cars going into the mine. We're now inside the 240 stamp mill. This was the first mill constructed here at Treadwell. In its first year of operation, 1885, this produced $280,000 worth of gold. That was so encouraging that by 1887, they had doubled its size to 240 stamps. Behind me, you can see the massive redwood beams that were used for the foundation here for the stamp mill. These beams are all bolted together with long bolts. The actual stamp mills are set on the floor above us here. Each of the stamps weighed about 1,000 pounds apiece, and they went up and down 90 times a minute, crushing the ore. The shoe, which is the bottom portion of the stamp, was replaced often because it wore down readily. The ore was brought into the mill from above and fed automatically to the back of the stamps. Water was fed constantly into the mix. And as the ore was crushed, it splashed through a screen on the front side of the stamp onto the amalgam plate. The amalgam plate was a copper sheet coated with mercury, and the mercury captured the free gold. When that combination of mercury and gold were heated, the mercury vaporized, and that left pure gold. All the gold could not be removed by the stamping process alone. So after it came off of the amalgam plate, the ore went to a large adjoining area called the vanner room, or concentrator floor. The vanners were located in this area adjacent to the stamps. Vanners were endless belts, about 5 feet wide, 16 or 18 feet long, and they rolled uphill on an incline. They vibrated also. At the high end of the vanners was a spray of water constantly on the belt. They put the concentrates that came through the milling process onto the vanners, and it shook uphill with water. The light material, which was mostly sand, would fall off the bottom end of the vanner. The heavy material, which included the gold, fell off the top end of the vanner. A chlorination plant was added here in 1889 to extract the gold that they could not extract through the stamping process. Here we have a Pelton wheel. Originally it was Pelton wheels that powered all the machinery here in the Treadwell complex. This Pelton wheel powered the 240 mill. Water was directed from a nozzle under pressure into the cups, and it spins the wheels around, and it powered any piece of machinery that the shaft was hooked to. Actually, the water was directed to the cups on the bottom so it didn't splash everywhere. This is a 240 mill in about 1890. The very first vertical shaft here at Treadwell was located where I'm standing. This shaft went down about 400 or 500 feet, and from that they tunneled horizontally in that direction so they could come up underneath a large ore body they had found. In 1894, they started to drill the second vertical shaft here at Treadwell under where I'm standing. Eventually, this shaft ended up at 1,950 feet deep. As they went down, about every 200 feet, horizontally they would dig tunnels into the ore body and searching for additional ore. Above the shaft here, they built a huge structure called a head frame. It was 108 feet tall, and near the top of the structure were two 19-ton crushers. So the ore was brought up out of the mine shaft to the top of the structure, dumped into the crushers, where it was crushed, came back down, loaded into rail cars, and it went to the 300 mill or the 240 mill. The power to bring the ore out of the mine was supplied by a large hoist mounted over the hill behind me. The head frame on the left covers the number 1 shaft. The taller head frame in the center is over the number 2 shaft. The building on the hill on the right houses the hoist. This foundation supported the hoist and the structure that covered it. The hoist itself sat on the concrete up above me here, and the cable came off of a roller through a hole in the building and out to the head frame, which is in this direction. It's quite a distance between here and the head frame, so between here and there were two intermediate structures, two derrick-like structures with rollers on top that supported the cable. The ore was brought up out of the mine shaft in a large bucket-type device called the skip. And the men were brought up and down in what was called a cage. The men could also ride in the skip. This hoist was installed in 1905. It was capable of raising 8 tons of ore at 2,300 feet per minute. Until 1896, nearly all the ore for the Treadwell mine came from this open pit behind me. They took over 5 million tons of ore from this pit. This was called the Glory Hole. It was called the Glory Hole because this was the mother lode. The ore was rich here. It measures about 1,700 feet from west to east, 450 feet wide, and 450 feet deep. This is the Glory Hole in 1890. That's the Treadwell number 2 head frame on the left. The ore was blasted off the sides of the pit. It slid down into chutes at the bottom. There it was loaded onto ore cars and pulled by horses or mules to the main shaft, where it was hoisted up to the head frame. This is the last remaining mine car here at Treadwell. Of course, at one time there were lots of these, both below ground and on the surface. The cars like this below ground were pulled by horses and mules. On the surface, they were pulled by electric locomotives. This was one of Alaska's first hydroelectric plants. This was built in 1898. It's called the 240 plant. This facility was constructed to provide electricity to the 240 mill. It was kept operational into the early 1960s. It required a lot of water to run this mine, and this is how it got here, in a whole lot of feet of riveted pipe. But where did the water come from? Well, we're going to have to take a little hike up the hill, and I'll show you the answer to that question. Behind me you see what was probably the first dam that they built here on Parish Creek, and most likely the starting point for the Treadwell ditch. Between the years of 1882 and 1889, they dug 18 miles of ditch lines to capture the water to bring it to Treadwell. 15 miles of ditch line goes to the west, ever increasing in altitude, capturing the water and bringing it this way. The ditch crosses Parish Creek behind me and goes to the east, where it is fed into the pipelines that lead down to the mills. The pipelines behind me are coming down the hill at about a 45-degree angle. So by the time this water gets to the mill, it's got up a pretty good head of pressure. In the summer of 1889, a man by the name of Thomas Mine came to the area. He was representing the Rothschild brothers and some English investors. He took a look at the Treadwell mine and liked what he saw. And on behalf of the investors, he purchased the Treadwell mine for $4 million. Of that amount, John Treadwell got $1.4 million for his interest. The new company sold their stock on the London and Paris Stock Exchange, and through that mechanism were able to generate the necessary capital to expand on the mining facilities here. We're now in the 300 stamp mill. This was built in 1899. Here they mounted the stamps on concrete, and there are 30 foundations like this here in this building that held 10 stamps apiece. This was the largest stamp mill ever built anywhere in the world. The building on the left houses the stamp mill. The one on the right is the vanning room. This is the interior of the vanning room. About 60% of the gold was recovered by the stamping process alone. The rest was recovered from the concentrates developed by the vanning room. Starting in August of 1899, they closed the chlorination plant and started bagging up those concentrates and sending them to a smelter in Tacoma, Washington. This was the main dock of the Treadwell facility. Behind me, the concrete structure you see was at the end of that dock, and that contained a saltwater pump that they could use in times of emergency to pump more water into their system. Out on the dock behind me was the warehouse facility, and about where I'm standing was once a large machine shop. Here we see the interior of the machine shop. The Treadwell mine was totally dependent on an adequate supply of water to keep its machinery in operation. There were occasional months in the summers when it was dry that there was insufficient water to do that, and there was always times in the winter during the freeze-up where there was insufficient water. And during those periods, they were forced to shut down part or all the machinery in certain mills. To eliminate that problem, in 1899, the building behind me was constructed. This was a steam plant. It was equipped with many coal-fired boilers to produce steam. And they converted their equipment to run on steam in addition to water. There was quite a system of asbestos-covered pipes going throughout the Treadwell complex to transport the steam to the various mills, and the steam was also used for heating in all of their buildings. Then in 1914, this building was converted to produce electricity. I'm standing in an area that once provided the miners with some entertainment and exercise, if you think they needed it. This was a tennis court. This pipe held the net that went across the court this way. The court was enclosed with chicken wire, supported by these pipes that went around the circumference of the court here. The court is sort of sandwiched in between the steam plant, which is here. There's a large oil tank over here. The rail line ran just behind the court here, and the superintendent's house was on the other side of the rail line. As a community, Treadwell was unique in a number of different ways. There were no churches, no bars, and no fraternal organizations here. Of course, if the miners wanted to partake in those activities, all they had to do was go into Douglas, which was just outside of the mine property. Also, there were no roads here. Of course, there was quite an extensive system of the narrow gauge railroad for the mining activities that carried the ore and mining equipment. For people, there were planked boardwalks and stairways led just about everywhere. And of course, there was no government here, which meant there were no taxes. This was a company town. All the buildings here were painted red with green trim. The company provided police protection and schooling for the kids. I'm standing about where the first schoolhouse was located. It was a one-room affair with a second story where the teacher lived. There were 24 students here in the first year of school in 1903. By 1910, that had grown to 56 students. That required two sessions of school per day. The younger children went in the morning, the older kids in the afternoon. From 7th grade and above, they went to school in Douglas. By 1916, school population was too high for the one-room school, and a new school, two-room affair was built on the beach below us. I'm standing on what was once a rail line. Came this way and went down this ridge off to the main dock. Next to the rail behind me here, on my right, was the superintendent's house. The superintendent's house was the largest house in Alaska. On the trail to my left was another rail line, and above us here was the elevated rail line that brought the ore from the Treadwell mine to the 300 mill. The mines here operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 363 days a year. They closed down only for the 4th of July and Christmas. Behind me was the town plaza. This was the place to be on the 4th of July. This is where the band played. There were games of chance and skill and cash prizes, large cash prizes. This was a fun place to be. The plaza here was about the only level ground in all of Treadwell. There were two flagpoles here, one with a flag of the United States and one with a flag with the Treadwell logo. The Treadwell logo was a capital T inside a diamond shape. Over here on my right was the assistant superintendent's house. And behind that was the butcher shop. Next to that was the store. And behind the store is what they call the new office building, which is there today. On the ridge behind me was the assay office. Behind me, on the hill to my left, was an apartment house. And down here on the level ground to my left was a building called the stables. Now this pipe is called a fire monitor. It's like a fire hydrant with a built-in hose on it. It had a nozzle that could be directed in case of fire in the area. These things were scattered throughout the Treadwell facility. You note the valve here is still in place, and it's in a depression. These depressions were filled with horse manure for insulation to keep the pipes from freezing during the wintertime. I'm standing about where the main entrance to the store was once located. This was a well-stocked facility. They had just about anything that you could want. They had food, including canned goods, fresh produce and fruits. They sold hardware items, furniture, clothing for men, women, and children, boots and shoes. Whatever they didn't have, they would order for you. The company kept the prices low for their employees. At first, the office for the mine complex occupied this front corner of the store, both the ground level and the second floor. Behind me, you see the concrete vaults. These were enclosed within the store structure. The store was made of wood and has long since burnt down. In 1914, they decided they needed more office space, so they started the construction of the concrete office structure behind me. Here we are inside what was called the new office building at Treadwell. It's one of the few concrete structures they built here. One of the really interesting facts about this place is when they moved in here in 1915, they hired their first woman employee here at Treadwell to work inside this building. This photo shows the exterior of the new office building. Here we see what the office employees wore to work. I'm standing where the assay house once stood. This was a very modern facility, obviously quite capable of determining the values of ore samples. The Treadwell company offered free service to miners anywhere from Alaska could bring their ore here for to have it assayed for free. Of course, their feeling was if somebody ever made that big strike, they need a big company to help them develop their claim, and the Treadwell company would be there available for that. The only thing left of the assay house is the two concrete piers, this one and one staying over here. These were a very important part of the structure. They provided the base for the very accurate set of scales that they had upstairs and weighing the samples and determining values of the ore. The rows of concrete piers that you see here supported a series of bunkhouses. The single room was 8 foot by 10 foot. Double room was 8 by 12. The first two were built in 1908. Second pair was built in 1910. There were 4 buildings in a row, 3 of which were 3-story structures. The 3-story structures held 82 men in a building. One of these structures was probably for the foreman and more special people. It had 40 rooms with separate outside entrances for each room. Of course, these buildings were equipped with hot and cold Rhine water, steam heat. When you walk down Sandy Beach here, you can't help but notice all the broken white china. This came from the building that was once located behind me here. It was a boarding house. It contained the dining room and kitchen facilities to feed the miners. It had a dining room that was capable of seating 500 men at a time. On the second floor were sleeping rooms. When the boarding house was first constructed, it was built on pilings out over the water. And then as mining progressed, they filled in underneath of it with tailings from the mine, and then eventually they filled in the beach far beyond it. This early photograph of a group of miners waiting for dinner in front of the boarding house clearly shows it on pilings. In this 1915 photograph, the boarding house is on the left. The office building is in the center, and the store is on the right. You can see that the tailings had filled in beyond the boarding house. The pilings here supported what was called the Treadwell Club. This building measured 56 feet by 260 feet. Cost $15,000 when it was built in 1904. And this was a recreational facility for the miners. Inside the club here were bowling alleys, there were pool tables, billiard tables, there was a Turkish bath, there was a dark room for photographers. There was also a reading room here with newspapers and magazines from throughout the world. And there was a room where the company provided the miners with envelopes and writing paper so that they could communicate with their friends and relatives back home. There was a 15,000 volume library here and a 500-seat theater. There was a barber shop. It was in the theater where the kids on Saturday got to watch the silent movies, and then the adults got to watch the same movie Saturday night. The theater was also the site of many theatrical and musical performances. It was a great source of entertainment. On this side of the club was another building called the Natatorium. Basketball was a popular sport here even then, and inside the Natatorium was a full-size gymnasium. There was also a 30 by 70 foot heated pool, steam heated pool of course. They had separate hours for the women to use the pool and the men and the children. But both of the facilities, the club and the natatorium, were open 24 hours a day. Other sports were popular here also. This is the 1913 football team. In 1910, the average wage for a miner here was $100 a month. They had a $1 a month payroll deduction so they could use the club facilities, and $1.50 a month for medical care. They paid $2 a month for their room and $25 a month for their meals at the boarding house. The married couples who had the small houses here paid $12.50 a month. Life here was pretty good. The tailings here on Sandy Beach are slowly being eroded away. The pilings you see behind me were constructed as a retaining wall to keep the tailings from flowing into Gastineau Channel. They didn't want to fill in around their dock and prevent ships from tying up here. The depth of the tailings where I'm standing was once well over the top of my head. There was once a ball field out here on the tailing pile. Where I'm walking used to be a rail line through a residential area here called Treadwell Heights on a little ledge up above the bunkhouses. There were 10 houses on this side of the rail line and 5 up above. There were a number of little residential areas scattered throughout the Treadwell complex. It was a very diverse group of men that worked here in the Treadwell mine complex, manning shovels like this and doing other tasks. Mostly there were immigrants. There were Germans, Scandinavians, Irish, Austrians, Slavs, Russians, Finns, Japanese, Scotch, French, and many other nationalities. There were also some Alaska Natives that worked here. The workforce increased up until it peaked out at about 1910 with about 1,900 employees here. We're now on the property that was part of the 700 mine. The shaft is off in this direction, and the mill is in this direction. First, we're going to go down and look at the mill. This is the 700 mill. It was built in 1898 as a 100 stamp mill. And the first year of production, which is 1899, they crushed 85,000 tons of ore here. Unfortunately, they found a very low-grade ore at the 700-foot mine to start with, so they were forced to close between the years of 1902 to 1907. The Treadwell Company leased this property during its years of closure, and they continued to do exploratory work. They were able to find some better ore below the 800-foot level, so in 1908, the mill was refitted and the 700 mine was back in operation. And during that year of 1898, they dug a tunnel from the 700 mine underground toward the Treadwell mine, and the Mexican mine next door were tunneling toward the 700-foot mine. So during that year, the 3 mines were connected underground. So things got good here at the 700 mine. In 1911, they added 20 more stamps here. Then in 1914, they added 30 more. That brought the total to 150 stamps, which made this a pretty good-sized mill. The vanna room was right on this side of the stamps. The boilers for the 700 mill were mounted in this area here. The boilers, of course, made steam to operate the mill. In 1900, Frederick Bradley became the consulting engineer for the Treadwell mine. It was a pretty prestigious position. And Mr. Bradley only had 2 years of college, but he had achieved some successes in mines in the lower 48 states. He was successful at the Spanish mine in California and again at Bunker Hill mine in Idaho. Bradley became the president of the Treadwell mine in 1910. As the president of the mine, Bradley decided he needed to cut some costs. So he decided to consolidate the operations of the first 3 mines. Until that point, all the mines had their own crushers. Bradley decided that the Treadwell, 700-foot mine, and the Mexican mine could share a crusher here at the 700-foot mine because it was in the center. To achieve his goal, Bradley had to make a number of modifications here at the 700 mine in 1911. First, they changed the shaft from a 2-compartment to 4 compartments. That shaft ended up going down 2,700 feet. Then next, a new hoist had to be installed. That hoist was the largest hoist ever brought to Alaska. It could haul the ore up 5,000 feet. The new hoist was enclosed inside this building. may be difficult to tell with all the trees here, but we're actually inside the hoist house. This is a good-sized concrete structure that's slowly disintegrating over the years. The hoist and the machine that powered it were mounted on the concrete floor where I'm standing. This was a steam-powered hoist, and it had a 13-foot stroke. As another indicator of just how large this piece of machinery was here, this was the exhaust pipe. So now let's take a little walk up above to the shaft and head frame area. We're now up in the area of the central shaft, or combination shaft. It went by both names. There are three large wheels here, about 10 feet in diameter. These wheels sat at the top of the head frame here and guided the cable from the hoist down into the mine shaft. Here we see a skip. This is what they hauled the ore out of the mine, and you can see the cable was wrapped here. This is the top of the skip, and as I said, men could ride in these. How would you like to ride up and down in something like this? The head frame here at the central shaft was really a monster building. They built the concrete foundation all the way around the perimeter here. This is the first head frame constructed out of steel. You can see the steel, some of the beams that lay behind me here that's long since collapsed. Like the other head frames, this held the crusher up above the top of the head frame where the ore was crushed, and it came down, and here it went to a large concrete storage bin. So here at the central shaft, the ore came from the three adjoining mines, the Mexican mine in this direction, the 700-foot mine where we're sitting, and the Treadwell in that direction. The ore was brought to the central shaft, up the shaft to the crushers, was crushed, and then placed into this huge concrete storage bin behind me. But this bin is divided into three sections so they could keep the ore from the various mines separate. The train went around all around this facility and through the center with chutes that gathered the ore and took the ore to the appropriate mill. Now here you can see the chute that's on this close-up of the chute here, where the ore came out to the rail car that would go right alongside the building here. You may think that with all the gold that was around here and men being paid low wages, dark, dreary nights here, there may have been lots of temptation for theft. Well, there were only two notable thefts during the history of the Treadwell mine. One of those occurred on January 13th of 1894 at the chlorination plant. When the foreman showed up for work, he noticed that someone had stolen all the precipitates from the cleanup tank. He called the superintendent called in the marshal. The material that was taken was about 90% pure gold, and they estimated it to be worth about $7,500. Well, within 2 days, the marshal had arrested Frank Juergens for the theft. Frank tried to bribe the marshal into looking the other way, but he was arrested anyhow, along with the second man, and all the gold was recovered. The other theft that occurred of any significance was in 1905, and it involved less gold and over a longer period of time. Prior to 1905, for several years, the superintendent had noticed that there were a discrepancy in what the assay value said they should be recovering and what they were actually recovering. So he called in the famed Pinkerton agency. And one of their agents showed up on the job, and he was obviously a very astute detective, because he realized that there was a Mary Freestone who was making frequent trips to Seattle. So he followed her to Seattle, got on a boat with her, went to Seattle, and as soon as she got off the ship in Seattle, she went right to an assay house and made a deposit. Well, he confronted her, and she was shocked and confessed on the spot. So it was her husband, over a period of years, the employee had been stealing the gold, and they were both arrested. They stole about $3,500 worth of gold. Now we've arrived at the Mexican mine. Both the mill site and the mine, the shafts are on the uphill side of the trail here. This is the Mexican mine. This is the main shaft for the Mexican miners right here. The owners of the Mexican consolidated with John Treadwell in 1891. And that year they started digging a tunnel here, right behind us. They dug a tunnel straight into the bank. They took out about 450 tons of ore that year, and they took it to Treadwell's mills for testing. The results of the testing of that ore were so encouraging that they built a 60 stamp mill off to the left here by December of 1893. Their ore was coming from their tunnel behind us here. They had found another rich body of ore like they did at Treadwell, and they were mining underneath of it, and they created a smaller version of the glory hole up behind us. In August of 1894, they started to dig what became their main shaft under where I'm standing. By the end of that year, the shaft was down 130 feet, and they'd taken out about 74,000 tons of ore. They also built the head frame above this shaft. We're now on the inside of the stamp mill at the Mexican mine. As you can see, they used redwood foundation here also. This mine was doing quite well, and they doubled this in size to a 120 stamp mill in 1896. The vanna room was on the beach side of the stamp mill. Here at the Mexican, you get to see what the vanna rollers look like. Here's a whole pile of vanna rollers here. This is the rollers that carried in this belt that I talked about, that revolved and vibrated to process the gold after it went through the stamp mill. Accidents were all too common here when the mine was in operation. There were countless injuries here, and about 200 fatalities during the lifetime of the Treadwell mine. Of course, that was considered a pretty good record in those days. The worst accident to occur as far as loss of life is concerned during the entire history of the Treadwell mine occurred 1,100 feet below where I'm sitting. It was on March the 3rd of 1910 at 11:25 p.m. The cage had gone down to the 1,300-foot level and brought the men up for their evening meal. At the 1,100-foot level, there were 39 men waiting for the cage for their turn to come up when a devastating blast occurred. 38 of them were killed. One man was killed waiting by the shaft at the 990 level. So there were 39 fatalities that evening. The explosives that they used in those days were quite unstable, and they were careful about not storing too much of it around, certainly where the people lived or worked. But they needed some on the job for the daily use. So they stored it right next to the vertical shaft. Their thought was, if there was an accidental blast, the force of the blast would be wasted up the shaft or down the shaft, and not into the tunnels where the men would be working. Unfortunately, on that day, all the men were standing in harm's way. Well, behind me is the hoist for the Mexican mill. The rollers are still in place here. This, of course, was covered with a structure, and the cable went off the rollers to the head frame, which is right over this direction. This is a side view of the Mexican hoist. Pretty much intact. Here you see where the operator stood to bring the ore and men up out of the mine. The control levers are still in place. In 1899, the Mexican mine and the Ready Bullion mine went together and constructed a 400-man bunkhouse on these pilings. And just beyond us here, on the beach toward the Ready Bullion mine, were two apartment buildings. And up in the trees beyond that was a cluster of single-family homes. There was quite a stretch of boardwalk between the Mexican mine and the Ready Bullion mine where we are now. The boardwalk came along the beach, and next to the boardwalk was the rail line which connected all the mines. This is an overall view of the Ready Bullion mine. The head frame is on the left. The mill is on the right. We're now inside the Ready Bullion stamp mill. This was built in 1898 and started operating late that same year. In 1915, they added 30 more stamps here. You can tell the stamp mill by their distinctive concrete foundation that supported the stamps. The vanna room is on the beach side of the stamp mill. Here you see the water line coming into the Ready Bullion mill here. You see the valve is still in place that controlled the flow of the water into the mill. It was this 17-foot Pelton wheel that drove the Ready Bullion mill. I'm standing on what was once one of the main shafts here at the Ready Bullion Mine. This entire area, including the concrete structure behind me, was covered by the head frame. The crusher here at the Ready Bullion was mounted above this concrete structure, which is really a storage bin for the ore. The rail cars came through here and were loaded through the chute behind me, and the ore was taken to the mill. It was because most of the mining here at the Ready Bullion is under Gastineau Channel. The mine management began to fear that it may cave in and flood all the mines because they were connected. So in 1913, they installed a 36-foot concrete plug in the connecting shaft between here and the Mexican mine. In 1914, carbide lamps, headlamps, replaced candles while the men working in the mine. The Ready Bullion was the last mine to make that transition. Prior to then, each man was given a handful of candles when they went to work. These men were working by candlelight at the 1,500-foot level. In 1907, they started to test and construct a cyanide plant. They wanted to be able to process all of the concentrates themselves. By 1910, that plant was constructed, and they stopped shipping the concentrates to Tacoma. So once again, they were producing all their own gold here on the mine property. Each morning, mine cars filled with concentrates from the 4 banner mills would arrive here, and the cars were winched up the steep tracks behind me to the cyanide plant. The concrete structure behind me is the refinery. The cyanide plant consisted of 2 huge wooden structures to the side and above the refinery. The winch that pulled the cars up to the cyanide plant is in this building. Inside the building, you can see where the operator made it up the steps to his platform, where he could operate the winch by looking out of the window in front of him. This is how cyanide was shipped to the facility here in these containers. You see on this one, you can still see remains of Treadwell, Alaska. This is the last of the great relic here at the Treadwell. This is a tube mill, which is really like a giant tumbler. They put the concentrates into the mill, into this opening that you see there, and they added Danish flint. Flint is very hard, so it was able to crush the ore, pulverize the ore actually, as it was tumbled around and around and around. We're now inside the refinery. This is where they made the gold bars, so not everyone got to come into this building. This was a secure area. You'll note the bars on the windows, and this is a vault where they stored the gold bars. The gold was weighed on this set of scales. The vault is on the right. This worker removed the hot gold bars from the molds. Note the heavy gloves he is wearing. These were the last gold bars made here at Treadwell. The value of $215,558.31 is written on the photograph. They had the first annual New Year's Eve ball for the cyanide plant, which included the refinery, in 1910. Some of the dances they did that night were the Golden Waltz, the Tube Mill Two-Step, and the Ready Bullion Polka. The process of separating the gold from the ore was fairly long and involved. Well, attached to the program that night in 1910 for their New Year's Eve ball was a series of drawings and prose done by those who worked here, explaining the entire process. So I'm going to let the miners who worked here tell you how they did it.
The rock is blasted with giant powder and broken with hammers deep in the hills, whence, hoisted by buckets to the surface, 'tis trammed in cars to the various mills. The rock, then crushed to 3-inch size, is passed to the stamps to pulverize. These stamps, 1,000 pounds in weight, splash out the rock to the amalgam plate. From the plate to the vanner, the sands then drop, which separates the values with its vibrating top. Then the sands of small value are taken in haste to the big filter presses to be run to waste. Up the long track the concentrates go. Then, weighed, they are fed to the tubes below. To 200 mesh are the concentrates ground, as the tube filled with pebbles goes round and round. To the classifier then this fine product goes, where the coarse is raked back and the fine overflows. This overflow goes into the pachucas to a cyanide solution protected with lime. Thrice agitated by air and decanted as well, the gold is dissolved in 2 days' time. Into the gold solution comes a replacing zinc, which throws down gold precipitate, black as ink. The precipitate, fluxed with litharge, is fed to the blast furnace, where the gold melts with the lead. The lead bullion then into the reverbatory is cast, where the lead coupled off leaves gold bullion at last. So by boat to the mint goes the gold bullion then, whence, stamped into coin, it comes back to the mint.
Early on, there was a small foundry at the Treadwell mine. In 1909, they built a new facility here at this location, which is the point of land which sticks out in front of the Mexican mine. It cost $20,000 for this facility, and they had an extensive set of sand molds which they could cast parts for their heavy machinery. This facility was operational up until about 1944. And they built parts for not only the mining industry, but for other industries as well. Now that we have walked through all the mines, let's look at the entire Treadwell complex as it appeared in its prime. This is the 300 mill, the superintendent's house, the store and office, the glory hole, the 240 mill, Treadwell Heights, the bunkhouses, the Treadwell Club, the nanatorium, which was the site of the pending disaster, the combination shaft, the 700 mill, the Mexican mill and head frame, the refinery where the gold bars were made, the cyanide plant, the foundry, the 400-man bunkhouse, which was shared by the Mexican and Ready Bullion mines, the 2 apartment houses, a cluster of small homes for the married workers at the Ready Bullion mine, the Ready Bullion mill, and the Ready Bullion head frame. Over the years, there was lots of caving going on down in the mines and the shafts that were no longer used. And occasionally, minor cracks would show up on the surface. By 1916, it was obvious that there was some major shifting going on, and major cracks began to show up on the surface. Some of the equipment was knocked out of alignment because of the shifting of the ground. The ground around the Treadwell Club and the nanatorium was sinking. Also in 1916, production dropped significantly at the Treadwell mine and at the Mexican mine because they were getting a lower quality of ore. The 240 stamp mill was closed down, and half of the 300 stamp mill was shut down. Production was also down at the 700-foot mine. On the positive side, production was up at the Ready Bullion mine, and there they were hiring more men to work underground. In 1917, the ground really started to move here. On April 20th, the pool in the nanatorium dropped 5 feet, and the building started to collapse. There was some major caving going on in the mine. The nanatorium once stood right behind where I'm standing, where there's now just water. It was on the evening of April 21st, 1917, and water was seen seeping into the ground behind the nanatorium. It started as a trickle, and then the tide began to come in, and it turned into a torrent. The ground was opening up and being washed away. The mines were being filled with salt water. At 11:15 p.m. that night, the alarm was sent out, evacuate the mines. Within an hour and a half, All 350 men that were underground that night were safely out of the mine. The superintendent and 3 others risked their lives by going back down into the mines to make sure everyone was out and to try and desperately determine what was happening and what the damage was. They were lucky to make it out alive, only because there was a skillful operator running the hoist that night that they made it. By 2:30 a.m. on April 22nd, the Treadwell mine was flooded, and the glory hole became the lake that it is today. The horses and mules that were in the mine did not make it out. Within a matter of hours, the glory days of the Treadwell mine were over. The concrete plug that had been installed to save the mines from a possible collapse of the Ready Bullion mine actually saved the Ready Bullion mine. It operated until December 18, 1922. After that, the sounds of the stamp mills were never to be heard again on Douglas Island. At its peak, there were 960 stamps here, crushing the ore, capable of crushing 5,000 tons per day. And during the years of 1885 to 1922, they crushed 28 million tons of ore. And from that, they recovered 3,227,986 ounces of gold. And that had a value of $66,946,198. And that was in days when gold sold for $20.67 an ounce. So the mines here at the Treadwell complex produced gold with a value of more than 9 times the $7.2 million the United States had paid for Alaska in 1867. So, whatever happened to John Treadwell? We had a brother named James who started a trust company. John invested all of his money in that company, and they lost it all. He went broke. He filed for bankruptcy in New York in 1914. Had about $3 million in debts and no assets. John Treadwell died in New York on November 6, 1927, at the age of 85. Well, now we've seen the Treadwell mine from its beginning to its end. And that concludes our tour here. Hope to see you again on the next one.